The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian, and thank you very much for listening in again. This is our first new show of 2020, and our first new show of a new decade, which already seems to have been christened, with a distinct lack of originality, as the Roaring Twenties. And yes, I am aware that, technically speaking, the new decade doesn't actually begin until 2021. But good luck with trying to get anyone to agree with that. As for the year that has just closed, 2019 was okay, but I'm disappointed I didn't get to see attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion, or watch sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. But we can't have everything. So, this week's show. Well, Jane Lee is sadly Uncle Mick. That's English Cockney rhyming slang for sick and lost her voice, but we'll get her back for next week's show. What else? Well, we start off the new year with news of the publication of a new ghost book, Britain's Haunted Heritage, and we have an interview with its author, John West. That's coming up later, but before then, let's catch up with some weird news stories. Our first story highlights the fact witchcraft is not merely some historical phenomenon or something only primitive people believe in. Abu Dhabi police have arrested a European man who allegedly claimed to help treat people's psychological problems and daily pressures of life through witchcraft. A Brigadier Ahmad Al-Mazuri, Director of the Criminal Investigations Department of the Abu Dhabi Police, said they learned about the suspect's alleged activities through informants. According to the Brigadier, the suspect would meet clients at his apartment after communicating with them through social media. They accused him of offering his services for a fee and duping his clients into believing he could solve their problems through his abilities. The Brigadier said that once they learned about the suspect and his activities, they devised an operation to catch the man in the act of practicing witchcraft and sorcery. His colleague, Brigadier Mohammed Suhail Al-Rashdi, who is director of the criminal security sector of the Abu Dhabi Police, called on residents not to fall for charlatans and to urge the community to report any suspects practicing witchcraft and duping their victims into giving them money. Next up, courtesy of my friend Nick Rigby on BBC News East, a tale of a glorious mashup that relocates the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Whisperer in the Darkness, to Suffolk in 1980 and merges it with the real-life Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, which is widely described as Britain's Roswell. The new BBC drama, which will go out on the BBC Sounds podcast platform, tells the story of an investigation into witchcraft, the occult and secret government operations centred on Rendlesham Forest, which was home to the US Air Base at RAF Woodbridge in 1980. Now for some folklore news. Tests aiming at establishing the truth of a legend claiming that Pocahontas planted a mulberry tree in Norfolk have proved inconclusive. Sad. The Native American travelled to England in 1616 with her husband John Rolfe after helping save his life back in the American colonies. Legend has it she planted a mulberry tree at a manor house in Heacham, where Rolfe was from. However, DNA analysis of the tree, carried out by the UK's Forestry Commission, have proved inconclusive. Rolfe and Pocahontas spent 10 months in England before her death in Gravesend, Kent in 1617, which is where she's buried. It's said that while visiting her husband's family home in Heacham, she planted a tree in the area. The tree, in the same spot, now stands on the grounds of Heacham Manor Hotel and still produces fruit. Anyway, now here's that interview with John West. My great pleasure to be talking to an old friend of the show, that's John West. And today we're talking to him about his new book, which is called Britain's Haunted Heritage. Let's start at the beginning with what is the book about? Because, I mean, this is quite a crowded area, ghost books. What angle have you taken on it?
I'm just keeping an eye on a big spider that's running towards me. I don't know whether that's a good sign or a bad sign, but he's perched under the table now.
I think if he approaches you from the left-hand side, that's when they bring you money.
Oh, right, he's coming from the left, so that's good.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, he's coming for it, and it's when they go from the right that's the problem, because that means that that's money running away from you.
Oh, see, I never knew that. I knew spiders were lucky, and obviously you're not supposed to kill them, but I didn't realise that. So anyway, he's hiding under the table now. As long as he don't go on me foot or up my trouser leg, I don't mind. Right, well, great to be back on your wonderful show, Charles. Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year and everything else. And the book, I've been fascinated with ghost stories since I was a child. My mum had loads of books, and I used to read them. One of the first books I ever read was by Elliot O'Donnell, and I think it was called like The Phantom Hearse, with its garish cover, and that sort of hooked me. So I've been writing for Psychic News for quite a while, in a magazine, ghost stories and that. And I thought, what? And there was actually a clairvoyant says, the spirits are saying you should write a book on ghosts, because I've done books on Victorian murders and the Romans and Oliver Cromwell. And I thought, well, I might as well. So basically, the book is all about British ghost stories, most from England, a few from Scotland, a couple from Wales, there's a few in London. And they're just stories that sort of perhaps are more sort of freakish, shall we say, sort of werewolves, and there's a vampire and these haunted stone heads and things like that. It's ones that sort of really sort of captured my imagination, especially as a child. So it all stems from the childhood, really, because most of the ones in the book I originally read about as a kid.
Of the ones you've written about, what was your favourite one?
Right, well, that is actually a hard question, because they're all particular favourites of mine. I probably the one about the Treasurer's House in York, the Roman soldier ghosts, because that was another one of my passions as a child, Roman history. And I went to York as a child on a school trip, and I didn't actually get to see the Treasurer's House where this happened, but I did see all the Roman ruins and that. Mm-hmm. So that's always fascinated me, because I'd love to see a Roman ghost, you see. So that's probably one of my favourites, yeah.
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with it, I know the one you mean now, but because I grew up in Scarborough, which is not far from there, so obviously any ghost stories in York were all big news in our part of the world. But just sum up for listeners what the Treasurer's House Roman ghost is about.
Right, well, it was a chap called Harry Martindale, who was a plumber, apprentice plumber, and it was in February 1953, and he was working on a heating system in one of the cellars in the Treasurer's House, because the Treasurer's House goes back to sort of medieval period. It was originally the home for the treasurers of the nearby York Minster. And he was working down there on his own, and he had a ladder against the wall, and, this light was on so he could see what he was doing. But in the middle of the cellar was part of the original Roman road. There'd been some archaeologists had been down there, and they'd been doing some excavations, and they'd left the Roman road exposed. And he didn't realise this at the time, because a Roman road actually runs underneath the Treasurer's House from the old legionary headquarters building to one of the fortress gateways, because York was originally a Roman fortress and town. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, he was walking down there, and all of a sudden, nothing happened on the first day, but it was the second day he was down there, and it was around about lunchtime from what he can remember. And he was actually standing on the third or fourth rung of the ladder, knocking holes in the ceiling with a hammer and chisel. And then all of a sudden, he heard what he could only describe as just the blare of a note, like a trumpet. And it kept just getting louder and louder, and it seemed to be coming from the wall itself. And he assumed that perhaps someone upstairs, because sound can carry and things like that, had the radio on, or was perhaps playing a gramophone or something like that. And he just ignored it. And then all of a sudden, the plumed helmet of a man holding a long trumpet-like instrument appeared from the wall beneath him. And you can imagine, his shock seeing this figure. And he actually fell off the ladder. And fortunately didn't injure himself, and he scrambled into the corner of the cellar. But the soldier was, interesting enough, only visible from the knees up until it got to the level of the Roman road, and then he could see the whole figure. And but then behind this chap was someone else on the horseback, this Roman soldier, and he was always struck, he said, by the fact that the horse wasn't like a sort of charging stallion, prancing stallion. It was like a cart horse. Mm-hmm. And again, the full body of the horse was only visible from when it reached the Roman road. And this was followed by another 20 Roman soldiers all marching in pairs. And they just came out the wall, walked towards the hold, and you could see all of them. And then they just went into the other wall. Now, the thing was as well with this, that he was quite shocked. One, they were solid. They weren't misty, because he'd heard about ghosts and he always expected them to be like see-through, wispy little figures like you get on sort of cover of M.R. James books and things like that. But these were totally solid. And they were nothing like the sort of Hollywood image of Roman soldiers, a bit like Charlton Heston, sort of, clean-shaven, square jaw, all dressed in red, immaculate. These were nothing like that. They were all unshaven. They were unkempt. They looked scruffy. They didn't have square shields either. Again, like the classic image that you get of Roman soldiers. These were all round. And they weren't in red either. They were in green. And they just looked really sort of disorganized, scruffy, really down at heel. Again, nothing like the image that you get of Roman soldiers, in the Spartacus films, things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were also making, he could hear them sort of talking. He couldn't make out any words, but it was like murmuring. And he could also hear the horses' hooves as well on the road. Well, anyway, these 20 soldiers marched in front of him, and as the last one went out of view, then that was it. He shot out of that cellar as fast as his feet could carry him, and he saw one of the people in charge of the building, and the chap just said to him, "Oh, by the look of things, you've seen the Roman soldiers." Well, right. Harry Martin was not impressed at all and probably swore a bit. And, he refused to go back there. And he actually went on sick leave as well. And there was a doctor's record of him actually going there and saying what he experienced. So there was some sort of evidence to back up what had happened. And so that's basically the story. The interesting thing is that it was dismissed at the time as, it was nothing like Roman soldiers. He must have got it wrong. It was hallucination. But then archaeologists looked into it, and it turned out that in the later Roman Empire, they didn't look like the classic image that you always imagine in the films. They did look like that. They did have different types of uniforms. They did look unkempt. And also there's a fear there might have even been Roman auxiliary soldiers who recruited from the provinces, and they did have round shields and didn't have the standard equipment that the legionaries had. Yeah. They were sort of a separate body in the Roman army. So, and it later transpired as well that other people had seen things in the building. Way back in the 1920s, there was a lady that attended a fancy dress party there, and she was wandering around on her own, and she got quite annoyed because someone dressed as a Roman soldier barred her way and looked very aggressive, and she complained to the person hosting the party, "Oh, that was a very rude person." They said, "Well, there's no one here dressed as a Roman soldier." So, and apparently an academic sometime in the 40s also supposedly saw the figures, and I was never able to sort of get any sort of first-hand evidence of that. It's just hearsay that someone went there and saw stuff. So, but yeah, so that's basically the story, fascinating. And you can actually now go to the treasurer's house and see the spot where he saw the Roman soldiers, because for years, it's owned by the National Trust now, the house. For years, they didn't like to talk about the ghost, but because now everything's changed, and you can go down there, you pay a little bit extra, and you can see the road where the soldiers appeared, the wall and everything. Funny enough, since the 1950s, nothing has been seen, but it's interesting to note that the cellar ceiling has been altered. And you're probably aware of this yourself, that sometimes in hauntings, if there's alterations to a building, it can either increase the activity or raise it. And I do wonder whether changing the cellar ceiling and that has erased the hauntings. So perhaps soldier ghosts will never be seen again.
Yeah, well, the putting the central heating in and the pipes and things would have totally changed the ambience of the room. And I mean, there is that theory, isn't there, that ghosts are imprinted on the fabric of a building, and
Yes.
if you change it, you erase it. A bit like if you erase a CD or a memory stick of some sort. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Oh yeah, it's the stone tape theory. It was really sort of popularised in the 1970s, wasn't it, with Nigel Neal, the stone tapes.
Yeah.
And the theory that emotions, whether it's intense love or hatred or whatever, can imprint themselves in the fabric of a building or even the soil or a tree, and under the right conditions, whether it's someone who's sensitive to it or even the atmosphere or electrical disturbances, can replay it. And as you said, the alterations either activated it while he was hammering away on the wall, but then by changing the complete, the ceiling, has erased it. I did inquire, and people, and they said they get a funny feeling down there. That could just be because they're aware there was ghosts seen.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of anyone seeing any of those soldiers since the 1950s. There was another lady who, after Harry Martindale sort of came out of the closet, so to speak, and said, yes, I saw these ghosts, she'd seen them in the 50s as well. Exactly the same thing in the same place. Her dogs had reacted badly to it. And her daughter actually lived in the house with her and used to hear the sound of a trumpet as well. But again, that was the 1950s and nothing since then. So I sadly, for anyone who goes there, it probably looks like you're not going to hear or see the ghosts.
Yes, it does tend to be that way, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, the fascinating bit when the sort of story first came out was the fact that they appeared to be sawn off at the legs, and it's because they were walking at the levels that was the level for them. And you get other stories of in other parts of either ghosts walking above the ground level or below the ground level because they're walking on the what was the surface for them, 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Yeah,
exactly. Well, there's another story in there about Langenhoe Church, and the Reverend, I think it was Merriweather, saw a figure walk through a wall, and it turned out when he examined the wall of the church, there was a bricked up doorway there. And so again, that fits in. If it's a recording, it's just going through what was a door. It's not a conscious entity. It's like I often say, it's like perhaps some ghosts are like when you watch Clint Eastwood on a DVD on the telly. He's not actually there. He's not aware of you. It's just an image that's been recorded in a silver disc, and it's probably the same with ghosts. So I can't remember where it was now, but it was also another ghost story that ties in with this image. That it was a house somewhere. I wish I could remember where it was, but it was a lady in red was seen, and then over the centuries, it was a lady in pink. Then it was a lady in white. Then they could only hear her. And then nothing. It was like as if it was like winding down, like a worn videotape, that it was constantly being replayed. And first of all, the colours went, then the image, and then literally the sound was the only thing left. And eventually that went too. So I think I don't believe all ghosts are like that, because there's some that interact with people and speak to them and seem aware that you're looking at them. But I do believe that some ghost stories are literally just recordings, the stone tape theory, as I said.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, with those residual ghosts, stone tape ones, it does sometimes appears that they do fade over years, so that in earlier times you had people reporting, Romans, medieval people, but now they're not there, as if, I say, going back to your Clint Eastwood DVD, eventually the recording wears out, and for future generations, it's going to be people of the 18th, 19th and 20th century that they're seeing, and the older ghosts, it's not that they never left any ghosts, it's just that they've completely faded away.
Yeah, that's probably why you don't get many ghosts of sort of dinosaurs, or no ghosts of dinosaurs or cavemen and things like that. I think that the earliest ghost story I've ever come across in the UK, and I can't remember exactly where it was, an archaeologist actually saw a figure on a horse, and the dress was like the sort of Bronze Age, and it disappeared like as if it went into a burial mound. Yeah. So that was the earliest one. But yeah, I think you're quite right, because you don't get many, like an Anglo-Saxon site, you don't get sort of reports of Anglo-Saxon figures or Normans and things like that often. And I was saying that I used to work for Ipswich Museum Service, and a chap, Colchester Museums took him over, and a chap who worked at Colchester Castle had said that he'd seen a Norman figure on the stairs, in full Norman armour. You could tell it was that period. And he just called him Norman the Norman, which wasn't very original, but apparently he was seen quite often. So there are a few, but again, whether that's just a recording or whether that particular ghost is a spirit that just can't move on, because I do believe that some ghosts are, and it's covered in the book, some of the stories are clearly not just recordings because they interact with the people that have seen them. So I do believe that some are spirits that for whatever reason can't move on or won't move on, whether they're attached to a place or they're fearful to go on because, obviously years ago, you'd be judged if you're a bad person, you'd end up in hell. So perhaps these people, if they did perhaps lead a bit of a naughty life, they're worried about going towards a light because they don't want to end up with a pitchfork in them, shall we say.
Yeah, no, I say, and we can look forward in a few hundred years' time to people saying, and I was working there, and this person came through with a beard and a funny haircut and tight trousers, and he was holding a coffee mug, and we'll have ghosts of hipsters.
Exactly, yeah. A few from the 1960s, perhaps. Yes. A few hippies.
So along with the Treasurer's House in York, Roman ghosts, are there any other stories you'd like to mention?
Well, the stories are mainly from England, but there's a few in Scotland and a couple from Wales. And the Grey Man of Ben Mahui is an interesting one. That's in Scotland, and that's like a Yeti-like figure has been seen on the mountains, and that's quite a spooky one. I've got ones in there from the Tower of London, the Hairy Hands of Dartmoor, which is a ghost that tries to drive cars and motorbikes off the road. They see literally these hairy hands on the wheels. I've got the in there. There's one about Langinghoe Church, which is sadly demolished. It was demolished in the 1960s, and that was haunted by several figures, and that was a really weird case. Borley Rectory is in there, and the church, Harry Price, of course. I've got the Hexham Heads, which was these stone heads that were found in the town of Hexham in Northumbria, and strange things were seen round those. A werewolf-like creature, funny enough. Dr. Anne Ross was asked, she was an expert on Celtic mythology and artefacts, and she examined them, and she kept seeing this werewolf-like figure in her house while she had the figures there, the heads. And I've also got a story about the suicide house in Ealing, which was originally investigated by a famous writer, Andrew Green. And the reason why it was called the suicide house, because loads of people had been killed there. They threw themselves off the top of this like tower. Yeah. And they believed that ghosts were forcing them to do it. Haunted monks in Acton in London. Haunted theatre in Bath, the Lady in the Butterfly called that. Fyvie Castle in Scotland, there's some ghost stories there, the Green Lady. The Curse of the Setons, that's actually an Egyptian curse in Edinburgh. This couple brought back a bone and things started to happen. A figure was seen and they felt as if they were literally cursed, and they never had good luck after that. There's a werewolf story from Wales as well. This chap found a skull and then things started to happen where he was staying on holiday. So loads of wonderful stories there to sort of scare you at night if you're on your own.
And you mentioned William Corder, I believe. William Corder?
Yes, yeah, that's the Red Barn murder. That's nearer to home, up the road in Bury St Edmunds. And he killed this lady and they caught him. And after he was executed, they dissected him and his skeleton was given to a hospital. And this doctor, Dr. Kilner, stole a skull and replaced it with another one. And he kept it in his house, and all these weird things happened. A figure was seen. There were muttering, someone crying. A maid said that someone was asking to see him wearing old-fashioned clothes, and when he went into his surgery, the figure had gone. And there was a loud explosion in the study where he kept his skull. And he found the display case was shattered and the skull was on the mantelpiece sort of grinning at him. And things got so bad that he bribed someone to bury it in a local churchyard. Mm-hmm. So presumably Corder's soul, his spirit, wasn't happy that his skull had been taken away from the rest of the skeleton and was making his presence known, because soon as the skull was buried in his churchyard, and sadly we don't know where this happened, they kept it quiet, it's never been seen since. So presumably he's happy now that his skull's being buried in consecrated ground. And interesting enough as well, the skeleton, the rest of it was given back to one of his descendants in the last few years, and they had a service somewhere and had the rest of it cremated. So presumably he's doubly happy now, William Corder.
Didn't they, I seem to recall, I think it's in Bury St Edmunds Museum, didn't they use his skin to cover the report of the trial?
They did, and it's actually still there. There's a display case, there's a section, and incidentally, it's not haunted at that part of the museum. There is a ghost there, but apparently it's not William Corder. And there's the account of the trial bound in his skin. There's part of his scalp, including an ear. There's the murder weapons, these pistols. Yeah. Including the thing that was used to dig her up, his victim. So, and some sort of Staffordshire figures. And because the Victorians and that loved that murder for some reason. They even went to the lengths of making little models of the Red Barn where she was killed, Maria Martin, and little figures of Corder and her. So a bit grisly, but there you go. So the Victorians weren't as prudish as people think.
No, they were a bit gory when it came to murders and things like that. The more melodramatic, the better. Yes.
Well, in the book itself, just to finish up, there's a ghost of Jack the Ripper, and there's some illustrations there from a newspaper called the Illustrated Police News, which leave nothing to the imagination. The women on the floor all cut up and that. So it surprises people when I tell them that. They say, I didn't think the Victorians were like that, but as you said, they loved it.
Yes, I think it's that. It's happening to other people, not to us. So,
exactly.
Yeah. Have you personally had any spooky encounters?
I have. I live in a haunted property in Saxmundham, and when I first moved here, I heard knocks and bangs, and I once heard a woman sigh. And again, there's a theory that sometimes in haunted properties, if someone new moves in, it becomes more active. It's like the spirits are reacting. Who is this person? We haven't seen them before. And the duvet was pulled off the bed twice in the night, which did bother me, I must admit. Because people say, God, how can you live in a haunted property? It doesn't bother me, but that wasn't very nice, wasn't very pleasant. I did actually say out loud, look, I know you live here too, and I'm happy to share it with you because you've been here a lot longer than me, but can you not do that again? And it's never happened since. But interestingly enough, Jason Figgis, the film director I work with, he stayed here and he slept in the living room on the floor, and in the night the duvet was lifted off the bottom of his feet and someone tugged his foot. But you see, that was someone new here, so perhaps it was just, who is this person? Bit of a game. But there's that. When I lived in Lincolnshire, in a relatively modern house, it was built in the 50s, you used to have a sound of a dog running up and down the stairs. Now, I had a dog at the time, and people are going to say, oh, it must have been him. But I used to go into the bedroom where he slept because he had a spare room, and he was fast asleep, and it was never him. And the dog called Lucky sadly passed away, but the noise of that dog running up and down the stairs followed me to Suffolk. And in a place I lived in, Wickham Market, I used to hear it there, but then it suddenly went, so it's never happened since. So there was that. And also I almost had like a time slip experience. I was in Hereford, and there's like the ruins of an old priory there. I think it's a Greyfriars Priory. This was back in the 1980s. And I just felt when I was walking around, I was the only one in the ruins, and it all sort of, the modern sounds seemed to fade away. And it was like as if I was sort of going back in time, almost as if the building was becoming whole again. And I actually got scared, and I thought, God, because I was aware of time slips and things like that, as I've read about them in various books. Like I think Joan Foreman did a great one as well. And I think there was a TV series based on it. But I thought, God, I could end up stuck in the past, and people wonder what on earth happened to me. So I literally whirled myself back into the present. And then all the modern sounds came back, and that was quite spooky. And I've been to places and you get perhaps an odd feeling, but again, I'm very aware that if you're got prior knowledge of a haunting, that could affect your outlook. But yes, I've never actually seen a full-bodied apparition. I once, here out the corner of my eye, saw what I thought was like a lacy sort of arm, with lace at the end, like a woman's arm. But I couldn't be sure. But I've never seen a full-bodied apparition in front of me. But I've heard stuff and obviously experienced things being moved and things like that. But who knows? Hopefully, one day I'll see, or perhaps not so hopefully, one day see a full-bodied apparition in front of me.
Yeah. What about the future? Are you planning any follow-ups on that book? I mean, there are thousands of ghosts in the UK.
Definitely. Well, I keep writing for Psychic News every month. I mean, for instance, in this month's issue, I've got about the ghosts of York. So I've got enough material for a second volume. Obviously, I won't call it Britain's Haunted Heritage because that would just confuse people. But yeah. I've literally probably got about 90% for another book. So we'll see how well this one sells. I mean, at the moment, and thanks to you for letting me publicise it, I'm getting it sort of in a couple of newspapers and I'm trying to get it in the sort of radio and stuff. I think the fact that Uri Geller has done the introduction,
yes,
and Jason Figgis has forward has helped as well, because Uri Geller is still really famous, still, especially our generation. You can remember him back in the 60s with the spoons and that. And he graciously agreed to do the introduction, and Jason did as well. So people say, "Oh God, you got Uri Geller in there," and I said, "Yeah." So that's knocked people out. So hopefully, that will sort of generate interest. But yeah, definitely another volume is planned. Once I was sort of gauge how well this has done, and touch wood, as they say, hopefully it will sell well. And yes, I shall certainly get another volume out there, because as you said, there's so many ghost stories in the UK, and also perhaps a second volume I'll cover Ireland as well, as I didn't cover it in this one.
Yeah.
And I could end up doing loads. Who knows?
Yeah.
If I get time, of course, with all the other bits.
Yeah. How did you get Uri Geller to do the intro for you?
He's a friend of Jason Figgis. They worked together on a documentary about haunted Venice.
Right.
And so the connection was through there. Now he's a friend of mine. And I interviewed him for Psychic News, which was really good. I phoned him up because he now lives in Israel. He doesn't live in the UK anymore. So we connected basically thanks to Jason Figgis. And we're now friends, and hopefully we might sort of get a chance to work together on there's a couple of potential projects with Jason about ghosts and things like that. So with Uri as the presenter. So hopefully, again, if that happens, I'll let you know, Charles.
Oh, that would be brilliant. And in the meantime, your book, Britain's Haunted Heritage, is available on Amazon, at Waterstones.
Yeah.
Watkins, that's, for people who don't know, is a specialist bookshop in London.
It is. Cecil Court. Yeah, it's I think it's
one of the oldest, I think, isn't it, of the esoteric bookshops, I think.
It is, and I think it's the biggest as well, and it's been there for decades, I believe. Yeah, it was recently taken over by someone else. So yeah, they stock it. But I mean, you can get it on Amazon. Waterstones will, not every Waterstone stocks it, but if you go into your local Waterstones and order it, it's on their system. And just ask for Britain's Haunted Heritage by John West, and it's published by DB Publishing.
Right.
So, and they published all Richard Felix books as well. If you remember The Most Haunted Chap, he did a load of books on British ghosts. So they were involved with his stuff as well. Brilliant.
Well, as ever, a pleasure talking to you, and good luck with sales. I'll say it only came out, last week, I think, the book?
December. It was actually published. So I'm supposed to be going on BBC Suffolk to talk about it, but it's literally just been out just over a month. So I've already got a couple of newspapers reviewed. It actually one's in a Hexham newspaper today, so I've got to get a copy of that. But I'll be going on BBC Suffolk and hopefully some other stations. But yeah, it's I appreciate you interviewing me, Charles, about it, and more than happy to chat to you whenever.
Right, that's great. Okay, John West, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Charles.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
What's better than a ghost story? How about two ghost stories, and both associated with Ranworth Broad? That's a lake in Norfolk, England, as distinct from a woman of dubious character. One story is grisly, the other far gentler. So we'll start with the scary one first. Almost 250 years ago exactly, on New Year's Eve, the 31st of December 1770, The occupant of Ramnath Old Hall was an old soldier called Colonel Thomas Sidney. He had a terrible reputation as a bully, as a drunkard, as a notorious gambler, and not only that, a gambler who would frequently cheat to avoid losing a wager. That New Year's Eve, fueled by large quantities of alcoholic punch, the Colonel invited fellow members of the local hunt to ride out with the hounds at the stroke of midnight. As the clocks began to chime midnight, there was a loud rapping at the front door, which then flew open to reveal an unknown rider. The man was dressed in a long black cloak and wore a long black hat that concealed his face. "Come, Colonel, and follow me," said the mystery stranger. "The night is fair, and there is brave sport abroad. Follow, you and yours, I've come to fetch you. Drink up now, and follow me." Each man in the room ran for his horse, but before they could mount, the Colonel was up and away with the stranger. The hounds, having seen the stranger, turned on their heels and fled back to their kennel, too scared to follow. When a servant tried to hand his master, that's the Colonel, a cloak, the stranger pushed him aside with his hand, and, it is said, the servant bore the marks of the handprint until the day he died. As the guests tried desperately to keep up with the Colonel and his mysterious riding partner, they watched the pair gallop towards the Black Broad before hearing a terrified shriek, then a splash, and then nothing. Scared sober by what they'd seen, the guests took their excuse to leave and quickly returned back to their homes, leaving Ramnath Hall still lit up like a silent beacon in the dark night. The next day, the Colonel's solicitor arrived from Norwich after being urgently summoned. But when he heard what had happened, he turned as white as parchment and quickly burned his client's papers and the secrets contained within them. Some say the devil came calling for the Colonel that night, and he went willingly. Others that he paid the price for hunting on the Sabbath, or that he was punished for cheating by being claimed by old Nick. But all ended the same way, the devil claiming the Colonel and his soul. The Colonel is said to appear on dark and stormy nights, particularly around the anniversary of his initiation to hell, riding furiously round and round the Broad, steam hissing from whether the hooves of his horse, a black mare called Black Jezebel, touched the ground, before plunging into the dark depths of the Broad and disappearing for another year. The second Ramnath Broad ghost is a far more friendly spectre. The legend is the waters are haunted by the ghost of a medieval monk called Brother Pacificus. He can be seen on early mornings, although it may also be sighted on quiet summer evenings. Wearing his monk's habit, he rows a small boat across the Broad, with a small dog standing in the prow. The story goes that the brothers at nearby St. Benet's Abbey undertook the work of restoring the rood screen at St. Helen's Church, Ramnath. Brother Pacificus was entrusted with the task, so early each morning he would row his boat across the Broad to the Abbey to the church in order to carry out the restoration work on the screen. He was always accompanied by his little dog, and at the end of the day he would return by the same route. The last recording sighting of the ghost I found was by a Reverend James Brewster, who, whilst on a boating holiday in 1930 and about to enter a narrow waterway leading to Ramnath Broad, saw a boat being rowed towards him. Pulling into the side to make room, the visitor waited for it to pass. As he did, he noticed the rower was a monk in a black habit and, although clearly aged, had a very kind face. The monk smiled his thanks as he passed, and before dissolving into nothing just a short distance on. The Reverend Brewster says he thought there had also been a small white dog in the boat, but he couldn't be sure. Incidentally, if you can't see the ghost of Brother Pacificus, climb the 89 steps and 2 step ladders that will take you to the top of the Ramnath Church tower and look up, for as Brother Pacificus in his boat with his dog are depicted on the weather vane. Incidentally, Ranworth has one of the tallest church towers in the area, and the view from the top offers a spectacular view of the Norfolk Broads, and on a clear day you can even see the spire of Norwich Cathedral. There is incidentally also a version of this story which says Brother Pacificus returned to St. Benet's one evening to find that all the monks had been killed by soldiers acting for King Henry VIII during the dissolution of the monasteries. It's a sad story, but it didn't happen, as the abbey was not closed down during the dissolution, and nor were its monks slaughtered. The abbey was instead made part of the bishopric of Norwich, with the hope it would continue as a religious institution. Over the holiday season, I treated myself to a copy of Funk and Wagnall's Standard Dictionary of Folklore, Mythology and Legend. This was originally published in 1949, although my copy is a 1984 paperback edition. And it's a wonderful mix of stories from around the world, including many that you normally never see the light of day and I've never seen mentioned in any other book. It's also one of those books that's a treat to randomly dip into, as you can be certain of finding something fascinating. Here's a story about the meaning of the phrase the Grateful Dead, which is intriguing, as although I'm familiar with the rock band, I'm almost as old as them. I'd never before thought to ask what was the inspiration for the name. So here we go. It typically goes back to, well, it actually goes back to biblical times, but the story starts with the hero who's heading out on a journey, coming upon a group of people who are ill-treating or refusing to bury the corpse of a dead man who'd either died before paying his debts or didn't have enough money to pay for a funeral. The hero gives his last penny either to pay the man's debts off or to give him the funeral, a decent burial, and then goes on his way. Within a few hours, the traveller is joined by a companion. Sometimes it's a talking animal, but it's usually a human, who then becomes his friend and aids him in some impossible task or a series of adventures, helps him win a fortune, perhaps saves him life, ensures he marries a princess and basically lives happily ever after. At some point, the story ends with the companion disclosing that he is the man whose corpse the other one had befriended. So there you have it, the Grateful Dead. The biblical tale of Tobit, incidentally, is also about an example of the Grateful Dead legend, not the band. I was doing some research into bogeymen, the sort of bogeymen parents used to mention to frighten their children. You know, the sort of thing, you go to sleep now or the bogeyman under your bed will crawl out and eat you. I know, things parents used to tell their kids in those days. They'll all be locked up now. Well, perhaps it was only my parents who said things like that to me. And they were a totally dysfunctional family. Anyway, one of the bogeymen I recall my grandmother talking about, she was the child of the late 19th century, was Rawhead and Bloody Bones, which sounds particularly scary. So I did a bit of digging, and this is what I found. The first reference is actually back in the 16th century, 1548. It's mentioned about 100 years later when another writer said Rawhead and Bloody Bones were names used to awe children to keep them in subjection, in other words, to terrify them into being good. And a later dictionary, Samuel Johnson, writing in his Dictionary of the English Language, 1755, defined Rawhead as the name of a spectre mentioned to frighten children. Stories were common, particularly in Lancashire and Yorkshire, which is interesting because that's where I grew up, in Yorkshire, and later spread to North America, particularly the southern United States. Some versions have Bloody Bones as a kind of water demon haunting deep ponds and pits where he would drag children into their depths, as in, keep away from the marl pit or Rawhead and Bloody Bones will have you. There's a reference in a book on Somerset folklore that said Bloody Bones lived in a dark cupboard, usually under the stairs. And if you were heroic enough to peep through a crack, you would get a glimpse of the dreadful crouching creature with blood running down its face, seated waiting on a pile of raw bones that had belonged to children who had told lies or said bad words. If you peeped through the keyhole, he got you anyway. There's a Cornish version of Rawhead and Old Bloody Bones, and says he lives in an old cave near the village of Baldu in the southern United States. Rawhead and Bloody Bones have actually become two characters, or separate parts of the same monster. One is a skull stripped of skin that bites its victims, that's Rawhead, and its companion is a dancing headless skeleton, that's Bloody Bones. So there, Bloody Bones and Rawhead. Tell that to your kids if they won't go to sleep at night. And that should ensure that they don't go to sleep at night out of fear. Here's another story from Funk and Wagnall's Dictionary of Folklore, Mythology and Legend. And it's a Romanian fable of the town mouse and country mouse, which is basically where a town mouse visits a field mouse and the exchange of views. And in this story, the town mouse visits the field mouse and sees the store of nuts and grains in his country cousin's larder. The field mouse returns the visit and goes to stay with the townhouse and samples the goods in the town mouse's house, which happens to be a grocer's shop. This simple field mouse is not frightened when a cat walks into the room and asks the town mouse who this gentleman is. That, says the town mouse, carefully slipping into a hiding place, is our priest. Go kiss his hand. So the field mouse does, and as you can imagine, doesn't come out of it very well with the cat. As a result, the town mouse achieves his end and then moves off into the country to occupy the well-stocked home of the field mouse. There's an alternative version of it, not quite so grim. It's actually one of Aesop's fables. The town mouse visits the country mouse and doesn't like the plain food that's available with the country mouse, so invites the country mouse to visit him in the city. And while there are plenty of wonderful foods, the country mouse is interrupted and frightened so frequently he can never actually get down to eat something, and returns to the country saying,
I prefer a crust in peace to find things in the midst of fear.
So there. Let's have a look through the ritual year and see what events are being celebrated at this time. Now, we've spoken in the past about Plough Monday. That is the first Monday after Twelfth Night, and is very much seen as the end of the Christmas period and traditionally the start of the agricultural season for farm workers, hence Plough Monday. However, that was very much for men, and there's a female version of it called St. Distaff's Day, though it's sometimes also called Rock Day, as this was the day women traditionally resumed their spinning after the Christmas period. In case you're wondering, the word distaff and rock were implements used to spin yarn. This was before the invention of the spinning wheel, and they were very much closely associated with women's work, which is why we also have the phrase on the distaff side to describe anything that's got to do with women. Just in case you're wondering, there never was a Saint Distaff. This was a medieval joke, a bit like Saint Monday, which dates back to the times when people only had Sunday as their day of rest. So some people in some trades, shoemakers apparently were the main culprits, said that they took Monday off because that was St. Monday's Day and it was a feast day that they followed, skiving off work. Anyway, St. Distaff's Day, there were supposedly some customs in which men would try to steal the women's flax and tow, that's the stuff they were going to spin and then burn it, and that women would retaliate by throwing water over them, though it does seem possibly that was just made up in a poem by Robert Herrick in the 17th century and never actually happened. So there you have it. 7th of January, St. Distaff's Day. If you're a woman, get back to your spinning. I mentioned that Funk and Wagnall's dictionary contains a lot of folklore that typically is never mentioned elsewhere and it never really existed. Here's one, another quote from them. It's called Momentary Gods, although the Germans have a word for it, Augenblickensgötter. Anyway, these are gods who exist for a specific purpose and at a specific time for special places and who have no existence except for such purposes, time and place. So, a good example is in Arcadia, there is a god called Myagros, whose sole role in life is to chase the flies away during sacrifices to the gods Zeus and Athena. So if you think you've got a boring job, be grateful you're not the god Myagros. Those of you fans of the English writer of ghost stories and supernatural horror tales, M.R. James, or Montague Road James, will be aware that a common theme in his tales, they're all short stories, is of some kind of ghost or malevolent spirit coming back to torment, haunt, betray a murderer, a person who's done them wrong. It's a good example in Martin's Close, where the ghost actually appears in the courtroom and terrifies the accused man of his crimes. Where did he get those ideas from? Well, obviously, great imagination, but in one of those instances of fact being stranger than fiction, here's a story about a French scholar. He originally began his career as a lawyer and then moved into the church and became a prior and then later became a writer. His name is Gilles Ménage and he lived during the 17th century. He died in the year 1692. And one of the tales he tells from his days in court was about an example of divine justice overtaking a criminal in a remarkable manner. There was a country priest who had a reputation for being notoriously violent and vicious, and he had a dispute about money matters with the local district's tax collector, who soon afterwards disappeared, there being a strong suspicion that he may have been murdered by the priest. By coincidence, about the same time, a man was executed for highway robbery, and as was the way in those days, his body was gibbeted in chains by the roadside as a warning to others. The relations of the highwayman came one by one night and took the body down with the intention of giving it a decent burial. As we've mentioned before on this, in bygone times, having a decent burial was seen as a very important thing if you were to be resurrected and ever get to heaven. Anyway, the relations had taken down the body, but a patrol went by, and worried by that and not wanting to be caught with the body, they sank the body into a nearby pond, not far from the priest's residence. Some fishermen, a few days later, when drawing in their nets, found the body, and the neighbours, applying their previous suspicions to the by then much disfigured body of the highwayman, said, "That's the body of the tax collector who disappeared." The priest was duly arrested, tried, and condemned to death. He, however, continued to protest his injustice to the sentence, but when the day of execution arrived, he admitted that he had actually committed the crime of murdering the tax collector, but then said, "But I am unjustly condemned, for the tax collector's body and that of his dog," poor dog, "are still in my garden where I buried them. I wasn't responsible for the body in the pond." A search was made of the man's garden, and it was true. The body of the tax collector and his poor dog were found there, and subsequent inquiries brought to light the secret of the body found in the pond. So there you go. You can't avoid justice, even when you bury your murder victims in your garden and somebody else's murder victim pops up in a pond. Thank you, Gilles Menage, for that little story. And that's it. Time for me to go. Just remains for me to say thank you for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me again same time next week. Till then, this is Charles Christian saying goodbye. And don't forget the old Spanish proverb, also gleaned from my Funk and Wagnall: those who tell lies should have good memories. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.